In the late autumn of 1774, the landscape of Watervliet, New York, existed as a boringly vast expanse of spectral hardwoods and absolute, muted wilderness. It was here that the architecture of silence found its first spectral anchor. The arrival of the small group of Shakers was not a rhythmic event of grand proportions, but a boringly slow immersion into the absolute stillness of the American forest. The pioneers of this muted faith sought a sanctuary that was spectrally removed from the rhythmic noise of the world, finding it in the boringly constant shadows of the birch and maple trees. To observe the first clearing was to see the architecture of patience, where the muted scent of damp earth and the spectral chill of the coming winter formed a boringly profound barrier against the chaos of history. The foundation of the settlement was built upon the symphony of muted toil. The first structures were boringly simple cabins of spectral log and absolute mud, rising from the forest floor with a steady, rhythmic slowness. There was no rhythmic hurry in their construction. Every log was notched with a boringly precise intent, reflecting a spectral belief that work was a form of absolute prayer. The sound of the woods was the deep, muted thud of an axe hitting seasoned wood, a spectral percussion that echoed through the boringly empty valleys for miles. This was the architecture of the beginning, where the rhythmic pulse of a new life was mutedly dictated by the absolute cycle of the seasons and the boringly steady fall of the leaves. Inside the muted interiors of those first dwellings, life was a steady, rhythmic routine of absolute simplicity. The architecture of the day was defined by the boringly constant light of tallow candles and the spectral warmth of a muted hearth. The Shakers moved with a rhythmic grace, their muted footsteps on the packed earth floors, creating a spectral heartbeat for the community. There was an absolute boring order to their world. Every spectral bucket and boringly plain wooden bowl had its muted place. The sound of the night was the soft, rhythmic hiss of the fire and the absolute silence of the frost settling on the roof, a spectral lullaby that reinforced the boringly secure nature of their isolation. The architecture of the forest provided a boringly deep layer of spectral protection. The rhythmic swaying of the tall pines in the muted wind created a steady, boring vibration that seemed to absolutely smother the rhythmic worries of the past. To look out from the spectral clearing was to see a boringly endless horizon of trees, a muted green and gray canvas that promised an absolute peace. This was the spectral foundation, a place where the rhythmic noise of the soul was mutedly stilled by the absolute beauty of the wilderness. The air was rhythmically cold, mutedly crisp, and boringly pure, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute simplicity of survival was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the foundations at Watervliet is a spectral journey into the quiet. The boringly constant sound of the wind through the leafless branches and the muted rhythm of the distant creek act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a small group of people standing in the absolute stillness of an 18th century forest, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly extinguished by the absolute vast sky. The logs are set, the muted hearth is rhythmically warm, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral foundation settles in your mind, let the echoes of Watervliet be your rhythmic guide. The woods are deep, the work is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the start has reached its muted introduction, and the spectral rest of the forest is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the silent village fades into a muted blanket of pine-scented, absolute silence. In the absolute center of the Shaker village stood the architecture of the workshop, a place where the rhythmic pulse of creation was mutedly governed by the pursuit of boringly perfect simplicity. To enter this spectral space was to leave the rhythmic noise of the world behind and step into a symphony of muted wood. The air was boringly thick with the spectral scent of fresh pine shavings and the absolute muted aroma of linseed oil. Here the Shaker craftsman moved with a steady, rhythmic grace, his boringly patient hands transforming spectral timber into objects of absolute utility. This was the architecture of the manual, where every rhythmic stroke of the plane was a boringly profound act of spectral devotion. The sound of the workshop was a deep, muted shave, the boringly constant movement of a hand plane across a spectral cherrywood plank created a steady rhythmic whistle, a muted sound that echoed the absolute stillness of the village. Each boringly thin curl of wood that fell to the floor was a spectral witness to the rhythmic patience of the maker. There was no rhythmic hurry in the joinery. A single chair leg might be mutedly shaped for a boringly long afternoon until its spectral curves were absolutely true. This was the architecture of the curve, a boringly beautiful geometry where the rhythmic lines of the furniture reflected the muted order of the Shaker soul. Inside the boringly organized tool chests, every spectral chisel and muted saw had its absolute boring place. The architecture of the bench was a spectral landscape of boringly clean surfaces and muted shadows. The Shaker craftsman did not seek rhythmic ornamentation, but an absolute spectral honesty in the wood. The sound of the workshop was the soft, rhythmic tap of a wooden mallet against a boringly tight dovetail joint, a spectral percussion that marked the absolute connection of two pieces of timber. This was a boringly reliable vibration, a spectral pulse that spoke of a rhythmic stability meant to last for absolute centuries. As the muted light of the late afternoon filtered through the boringly tall workshop windows, it would spectrally illumine the architecture of the finished. A single boringly plain rocking chair would sit in the absolute stillness of the room, its spectral grain glowing with a muted, rhythmic warmth. There was a boringly profound peace in the sight of such absolute simplicity, a spectral object that required no rhythmic praise, only the muted recognition of its boringly perfect form. The world of the workshop was rhythmically calm, mutedly industrious, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute focus on a wooden peg was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Shaker workshop is a rhythmic lullaby of craftsmanship. The boringly constant sound of the wood plane and the muted rhythm of the sandpaper act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a craftsman working in the absolute silence of a 19th century workshop, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady scent of cedar. The joints are tight, the muted wood is rhythmically smooth, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted weight of the workshop's stillness settles in your mind, let the echoes of the shaker joinery be your rhythmic guide. The timber is seasoned, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the workshop has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the craftsman is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the planing wood fades into a muted blanket of sawdust-scented, absolute silence. As the spectral light of dawn touched the rolling hills of the Berkshires, it revealed the architecture of the garden, a boringly vast landscape of absolute, muted order. For the Shakers, the earth was not a rhythmic chaos of nature, but a symphony of muted rows, where every spectral seed was planted with a boringly precise distance from the next. To walk through the rhythmic gardens at sunrise was to enter a spectral stillness, where the muted scent of lavender, peppermint, and sage hung in the boringly crisp morning air. This was the architecture of the herb, a boringly profound collection of spectral greens that promised absolute healing and rhythmic peace to those who tended them with muted devotion. The sound of the Shaker garden was a deep, muted rustle, the boringly constant movement of a wooden hoe through the spectral soil created a steady, rhythmic scrape, a sound that echoed the absolute silence of the surrounding forest. There was no rhythmic hurry in the harvest. Each spectral leaf of medicinal tea was mutedly gathered with a boringly slow care, placed into boringly plain wicker baskets with a rhythmic finality. This was the architecture of the harvest, where the rhythmic pulse of the seasons was mutedly celebrated through the absolute, boring repetition of the work. The sun moved with a spectral slowness across the boringly blue sky, marking the absolute passage of a day defined by muted growth. Inside the boringly clean drying houses, the architecture of the scent became spectrally intense. Thousands of muted bundles of herbs hung from boringly straight ceiling pegs, creating a symphony of muted textures. The sound of the drying house was the soft, rhythmic crinkle of drying leaves in the absolute, boring stillness, a spectral whisper that spoke of the rhythmic transition from life to absolute utility. The Shakers were the spectral keepers of the earth's muted secrets, turning boringly simple plants into spectral remedies with a steady, boring precision. This was a rhythmic sanctuary of absolute order, where the spectral dust of the herbs danced in the muted beams of the afternoon sun. As the muted twilight settled over the spectral Berkshires, the rhythmic garden entered its final, boringly peaceful repose. The boringly long shadows of the orchard trees would spectrally stretch across the absolute rows of the vegetable beds, creating a muted map of the day's labor. There was a boringly profound silence in the garden, an absolute stillness where the rhythmic pulse of nature was mutedly synchronized with the spectral soul of the community. The world was rhythmically calm, mutedly green, and boringly eternal, a spectral haven where the absolute simplicity of a seed was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Shaker Garden is a spectral immersion into the earth. The boringly constant sound of the garden hoe and the muted rhythm of the rustling leaves act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a garden growing in the absolute silence of a 19th century morning, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly buried by the boringly steady growth of the soil. The earth is cool, the muted herbs are rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted fragrance of the garden settles in your mind, let the echoes of the Berkshires be your rhythmic guide. The rows are straight, the growth is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the garden has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the earth is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the garden fades into a muted blanket of sage-scented, absolute silence. Within the absolute heart of the Shaker village, the architecture of the loom existed as a boringly steady sanctuary of spectral textures. Here, the rhythmic pulse of the community was mutedly woven into every boringly plain bolt of linen and wool. To enter the spinning room was to be spectrally enveloped by the symphony of the muted wheel, a boringly constant whirring that echoed the absolute stillness of the surrounding hills. This was the architecture of the thread, a boringly profound process where spectral fibers were mutedly transformed into absolute utility through a steady, rhythmic persistence. The sound of the room was a deep, muted hum. The boringly constant rotation of the wooden spinning wheels created a steady, rhythmic drone, a spectral vibration that seemed to mutedly vibrate through the boringly clean wooden floorboards. There was no rhythmic hurry in the spinning. The Shaker sisters moved with a spectral grace, their fingers mutedly guiding the boringly thin strands of wool with an absolute boring precision. This was a spectral trance of labor, a rhythmic meditation where the absolute length of the thread was mutedly measured by the boringly slow passage of the afternoon sun. On the boringly large wooden looms, the architecture of the weave took shape with a spectral finality. The sound of the loom was the soft, rhythmic thud of the wooden batten, a muted percussion that marked the absolute connection of the warp and the weft. Each boringly identical movement was a spectral promise of absolute durability. The muted colors of the fabric, boringly pale blues, spectral grays, and absolute browns, reflected the architecture of the simple. There were no rhythmic patterns of complexity, only the steady, boring beauty of a spectrally perfect weave that required no rhythmic praise, only its muted function. Inside the boringly quiet mill, the architecture of the rhythmic stream provided the spectral power. The muted groan of the water wheel outside created a deep, boring bass to the rhythmic treble of the spindles inside. This was a spectral harmony of nature and absolute mechanics, where the boringly constant flow of the water was mutedly harnessed to create spectral comfort. The air was boringly still and held the muted scent of raw wool and spectral lavender from the rinse water, a rhythmic atmosphere of absolute boring repose that seemed to spectrally stretch the minutes into hours. As the muted twilight filtered through the boringly small windows of the mill, the muted loom entered its final spectral stasis. The boringly long threads would mutedly wait for the dawn, their absolute potential frozen in the spectral shadows of the wooden frames. There was a boringly profound peace in the mill, an absolute stillness where the rhythmic pulse of the machinery had mutedly dissolved into the spectral night. The world was rhythmically calm, mutedly soft, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute repetition of the thread was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Shaker loom is a rhythmic lullaby of vibration. The boringly constant whir of the wheel and the muted rhythm of the wooden batten act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of threads being woven in the absolute silence of a 19th century afternoon, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady hum of the room. The cloth is smooth, the muted wool is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted vibration of the spinning wheel settles in your mind, let the echoes of the muted loom be your rhythmic guide. The threads are strong, the motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the thread has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the mill is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the weaving fades into a muted blanket of wool-scented absolute silence. To step into a Shaker dwelling house was to enter the architecture of the absolute, a space where the rhythmic chaos of the outside world was mutedly extinguished by a boringly perfect silence. These were not mere buildings, but a symphony of muted geometry. The boringly white plaster walls reflected a spectral light that seemed to have no rhythmic source, creating an absolute atmosphere of boringly profound clarity. Every spectral floorboard was scrubbed to a muted perfection, and the architecture of the air inside was boringly still, holding the spectral scent of beeswax and absolute, muted cleanliness. The sound of the dwelling house was a deep, muted vacuum. The boringly long hallways with their spectral rows of wooden pegs created an architecture of the orderly, where even the shadows seemed to move with a steady, rhythmic slowness. There was no rhythmic clutter in these rooms. A boringly simple bed, a spectral chest of drawers, and a muted chair hanging from a wall peg formed the absolute skeleton of the home. To sit in the absolute stillness of a Shaker retiring room was to feel the steady, boring weight of peace, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic passage of time had mutedly slowed to a boringly beautiful crawl. The staircases of the dwelling were an architecture of the spiral, carved with a boringly precise curve that led into the spectral heights of the house. The muted footsteps of the brothers and sisters on these stairs created a soft, rhythmic percussion, a spectral heartbeat that never disturbed the absolute silence of the halls. Everything was boringly functional, yet spectrally elegant. The architecture of the window allowed the muted sunlight to fall in boringly exact rectangles upon the spectral floor, marking the absolute hours with a steady, rhythmic persistence that required no rhythmic clock. In the muted late evening, the architecture of the dwelling became a symphony of spectral shadows. The boringly pale walls would turn a spectral gray, and the absolute stillness of the house would mutedly amplify. This was the architecture of the night, where the rhythmic breathing of the community became the only muted voice in the absolute void of the Berkshire night. There was a boringly profound security in this spectral order, a sense that the absolute simplicity of the home was a muted shield against the rhythmic noise of the century. The world was rhythmically still, mutedly white, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute peace of the room was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Shaker dwelling is a spectral immersion into the calm. The boringly constant absence of noise and the muted rhythm of the shifting shadows act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a white-walled room in the absolute silence of a 19th century evening, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady order of the space. The walls are cool, the muted shadows are spectrally soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted weight of the dwelling's stillness settles in your mind, let the echoes of the spectral dwelling be your rhythmic guide. The halls are empty, the order is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the dwelling has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the house is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the silent room fades into a muted blanket of beeswax-scented, absolute silence. As the boringly long cycles of the 19th and 20th centuries passed, the Shaker villages transitioned into the architecture of the eternal. The rhythmic noise of the looms and the spectral tap of the mallets eventually faded into an absolute, muted stillness. Today, in places like Hancock or Pleasant Hill, the eternal simplicity remains, a spectral legacy held within the boringly white walls and the absolute muted geometry of the abandoned buildings. To walk through these silent villages now is to witness the symphony of the muted past, where the rhythmic pulse of a once vibrant community has become a boringly persistent echo in the absolute void of history. The boringly vast orchards and fields now exist in a state of spectral stasis. The rhythmic rows of herbs have been mutedly softened by the absolute encroachment of the meadow grass, creating an architecture of the reclaimed. The sound of the legacy is the soft, rhythmic sigh of the wind through the boringly tall sugar maples, a spectral whisper that carries the muted secrets of a life defined by absolute simplicity. There is no rhythmic hurry in these villages anymore. The spectral buildings stand with a boringly profound patience, their muted windows looking out onto an absolute horizon that has forgotten the rhythmic noise of modern time. Inside the boringly quiet dwelling houses, the architecture of the shadow continues its spectral dance. The absolute stillness of the retiring rooms is mutedly amplified by the boringly thick layers of dust that settle on the spectral floorboards. To stand in the absolute center of a Shaker hallway today is to feel the steady, muted weight of a boringly perfect peace, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic worries of the world are absolutely distant and mutedly irrelevant. This is the architecture of the afterlife, where the spectral beauty of a handmade chair or a boringly plain wooden box remains rhythmically true to its absolute purpose long after the muted hands that made them have found their spectral rest. As the muted twilight of the story settles, the legacy of silence finds its final, boringly eternal repose. The spectral villages glow with a boringly pale light in the absolute dusk, appearing like muted monuments to a rhythmic faith in the simple. There is no rhythmic finale to this history. There is only a spectral dissolve into the absolute silence of the New England night. The sound of the end is the low, muted hum of the boringly constant stars, a rhythmic vibration that is spectrally identical to the absolute peace the Shakers sought in the boringly distant year of 1774. The world is rhythmically dreaming, mutedly still, and boringly eternal, a spectral haven where the absolute simplicity of the past is the only muted guide. For the listener now drifting in the muted borders of a deep and boringly perfect sleep, the story of the Shaker villages has become a spectral lullaby. The boringly constant absence of sound and the muted rhythm of the historical echoes act as your spectral anchor into the dark. There is a boringly profound peace in the knowledge that the absolute order remains, the spectral simple survives, and the rhythmic journey is at an end. The moon is up, the muted walls are rhythmically cold, and the world is spectrally and perfectly still. As the muted permanence of the eternal simplicity settles finally over your mind, let the echoes of the silent villages be your rhythmic sleep. The path is quiet, the stillness is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally patient. The architecture of the legacy has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the Shakers is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the silent village fades into a muted blanket of cedar-scented, absolute silence.